Hey y'all, what's going on? Pavel with DAT Media here, and today we're going to be talking about 3 lenses that every photographer must have. Now when starting out, people always ask me what kind of lens they should get first. And I always advocate the use of prime lenses as opposed to zoom lenses for several reasons that I'm gonna get into later. But down here for you I have 3 lenses that I believe is a perfect starting kit for anybody trying to get into photography or even the professionals who have been in the business for a while. Now, I should just mention right off the bat that the brands that I'm gonna mention in this video, I'm not supported by them. They do not pay me to advertise their stuff. I purchased all of it with my own money. So without further ado, let's just talk about these 3 lenses that I have right in front of me. Now, the first lens that I'm gonna talk about is a lens that I have seen many photographers, even on YouTube, cover tons of times just because it is so useful and so versatile. And it's gonna be a 50mm lens. Now, in my case, I have a 50mm Nikon f1.8. That was the first prime lens that I've got, and again, as I mentioned before, I always advocate the use of primes versus zooms for most situations because prime lenses tend to give you a higher aperture than zooms. The zoom lenses recently have gotten better about making your aperture higher and higher. For example, the new Sigma 18 to 35mm that allows you to go all the way up to 1.8. However, most of the zooms like 70 to 200 or 24 to 70 still sit at an aperture of f2.8. And never mind the fact that those lenses are ungodly expensive. I think Nikon lenses run for about $1,000 and up. And then, of course, Canon and Sony lenses both run in the same ballpark. As a matter of fact, the new Sony G Master lens, 24 to 70mm f2.8 that came out is running at about a price of $2,200. Which is ridiculously expensive and not a lot of us can afford. That's why I'm saying that the use of primes allows you not only to save money, but also to get a really great quality image. So let's talk about the 50mm that I mentioned before. So 50mm Nikon f1.8, I have gotten this lens probably about 6 years ago or 7 years ago. It's been a while, so I've been with this lens for quite some time. Now, the good thing about this lens is it has electronic contacts right here, so it has electronic control, therefore your aperture can be changed via dial instead of manually twisting the lens. Now, the other good thing about it is the fact that it allows autofocus. The other 2 lenses that I have right here do not allow autofocus, and I'm going to talk about that later. But this lens does. It's a 50mm Nikon. It's a great little lens. You can get 50mm Canon, 50mm Sony, whatever your brand is or whatever lenses you prefer. All of them gonna roughly have the same quality. Now, there are several things that I like about this lens, and many other photographers love about this lens, is the fact that this lens really allows you to basically shoot in any situation. You can shoot tight shots with it, you can shoot wide shots with it. The only thing you will need to do in those situations is literally just walk further or walk backwards and get closer or further away from your target, and then you can shoot them from that distance and it's gonna look great. Now, considering that this lens has a maximum aperture of f1.8, it still gives you that really nice depth of field or bokeh effect that so many people rage about on YouTube because they're just going crazy about the bokeh. And there are lenses that Nikon develops, I think, and Canon develops that go even higher than that. There are some 50mm lenses that go up to f1.4. I believe Nikon makes that one, Canon makes that one. Rockinon, I believe, makes that one as well. There are also lenses, for example, that Canon makes that go up to f1.2. Now, that lens will cost you about $1,200, so it's extremely expensive. Now, there are also other lenses that are designed for Sony E-mount that I believe Voigtlander makes and Zhiyun-Tech, which is a Chinese company, makes. I totally probably butchered that name, by the way, but whatever, just bear with me here. And then those lenses go up to the maximum aperture, I believe, of f.95, so they really give you the crazy bokeh that you want. However, in certain situations, what I have seen is those lenses actually, if you're shooting a portrait, for example, with them, they would actually blur out half the face, which I'm not sure if that's what you want, but that is certainly an artistic effect that you can keep in mind if you're using a lens like that. The other great benefit of this lens is that not only does it have electronic contacts on the back, which allow you to do autofocus and change aperture via a dial, but it also has a manual f-stop ring as well that you can lock. And what that allows you to do is you can actually put this lens in adapt it to cameras like Sony or Panasonic that I did in the past, and I use this lens for video. Now granted, it's not going to be a declicked aperture, so it won't allow you for a smooth change of aperture. However, it's a versatile lens that can be used on other cameras with an adapter, and so basically for a price of $100, which is, yes, by the way, this is what this lens costs. It costs only $100, which is why I advocate it to people, and I say that everybody should have one because it's cheap and the image quality is great. And it has autofocus, which is also awesome in certain situations. But it also allows you to use this lens on other cameras and shoot video with it, shoot stills with it, shoot whatever you want with it because it's just so interchangeable. The other cool feature on this lens, which I see so many manufacturers get away from, and I don't know why, and I actually would like an answer, so Canon, Nikon, Sony, any of y'all manufacturers, if you're watching this video, please send me an email at the email link in the description below and tell me why you shifted away from doing this. And the thing that I'm talking about here is having your focus ring stop, and stop on one side and stop on the other side, and include the vernier scale, which is the focal distance scale on the lens itself, because it is quite annoying sometimes when you need to manually focus the lens, or if you're shooting a video and you have a talent walking up to you and there is no way that you can basically create your marks if you have unstoppable spinning focus ring that so many of the new lenses make that annoys the crap out of me, but I'm not gonna get into that. That's a rant video for another day. So it's really nice when you have a vernier scale, which means that you know exactly what your focusing distance is, and especially if you're shooting video, you know exactly how to pull focus on the lens when your talent is moving towards you, or when you're shooting something, you can make marks. It is just so much more usable instead of having a spinning ring, which basically doesn't allow you to do any of those things. So what is actually the benefit of having a 50mm lens? Well, the great benefit is the choice. The choice you have, you can either shoot tight with it or you can shoot wide with it. Again, as I said before, the only thing you need to do is literally move closer or further away from the target. But it also is really portable. As you can see, it's a very tiny little small lens. It fits in the backpack, it fits in your pocket. I have it handy with me pretty much everywhere I go. I always carry this lens with me, which is why it's kind of banged up a little bit and needs some work done to it, but it still works just fine. Now, what would I actually use this lens for? Again, as I said, I pretty much use it everywhere. I put it on the camera when I just go into town and I want to shoot anything. I always have my 50 setting on there because I don't know what kind of situation I will be put in. And this lens really allows me to basically adapt to any situation that happens and take a great photo. So the main advantages of having this lens is number one, the price, number two, versatility and being able to adapt to any situation. And in this particular case, on this Nikon lens, you have electronic f-stop as well as manual f-stop. F-stop, aperture, it's the same thing, by the way, most of you probably know that. And having vernier scale and having not just a spinning focus ring, so you can actually make marks and you can actually know exactly where your focusing distance is at. So I believe that those reasons justify and basically to the utmost extent that anybody in photography business, anybody and everybody in photography business must have this lens because it is just so usable and so cheap. Now let's shift to some of the other lenses that I have here on the table. I have a 35mm Rokinon and I have an 85mm Rokinon. Now those two lenses are not as versatile as a 50mm. 50mm is basically a perfect fit for any situation. Now these lenses have a little bit more of a specialized use. And when I'm talking about specialized use, I mean like, oh yeah, well this lens has only one application, that lens has only one application. That is not the case at all what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is the focal length. Shooting with a 35mm lens will basically allow you to take really wide shots. This is what this lens is mainly geared towards, is to shoot things like group photos, is to shoot landscapes, cityscapes. Some people do street photography with it when they really want to capture a wide frame of what is going on. I did some nighttime photography, some sky photography with that lens. It was great. So basically anything that requires a pretty wide lens, this lens would be a really good fit for it, especially considering that this lens also has a maximum aperture of f1.4. So this particular 35mm lens, as I mentioned before, is a Rokinon. Rokinon is the brand, it's a Korean brand that basically came into the market several years ago, and I first heard about it and I was like, oh, okay, whatever, you know, big deal, who cares? But then I actually started playing with those lenses and I've actually got several of them over the years. I still have my 35mm, I have my another 85mm. In the past, I have had a 16mm Rokinon. At my job, I had a whole set of senior Rokinons, 24, 35, 50, 85. And I've seen other people use different variations and different focal lengths of these lenses. For the most part, these lenses are actually pretty great. There are several facts about these lenses that I actually love quite a bit. Now, those benefits come with some drawbacks as well, so pay attention and decide for yourself whether this type of lenses is for you. So the benefits that I'm talking about in these lenses that I personally like, because I not only do photo but I also do video work. Number one, manual aperture. Now I'm able to change the aperture manually on the f-stop ring, which really allows me to adapt this lens basically to any mount. Again, as I said before, with a 50 that I used on Lumix GH3, GH4, and GH5. I've used this lens on a Sony A7S. I've used this lens on Sony A5100, many other mirrorless cameras that I've adapted this lens to, and I'm actually also used this lens on a Sony FS5 with which I shoot these videos. So this lens is really versatile. It allows me to adapt it to anything. I can use it for many purposes. It's just a good all go around type of lens. Now the other really good thing that I like about this lens, in addition to the same kind of reasons that I talked about with the 50, is the fact that it has, yet again, a vernier scale. So it allows me to make marks for the talent when I'm shooting a feature. It allows me to know exactly where I'm focusing. It doesn't have the spinning focus ring that I hate so much, and it actually allows me to know exactly where I'm at on the focal length and on the focus scale. And the third thing that I love about this lens, again, is the maximum aperture of f1.4. When I was buying my first set of lenses, which are these three, as you see, they haven't changed in several years, I was basically looking for perhaps a Nikon 35mm. But the problem is I couldn't find anything below f2.8 or f2.0. But I really wanted to have a lens that could be really wide open for low light situations. And this lens was the first lens for the price, because I basically bought this lens, I believe right now on eBay it's running in about between 400 to 550. I bought this lens several years ago for 250 bucks. And that was pretty much unbeatable at the time for the functions and for the build of the lens that I was getting. By the way, speaking of the build of the lens is really pretty solid. I believe it is brass, but it's really solid feel. It does not feel cheap. It does not feel like it's gonna fall apart in your hands or fall apart after a couple of shoots. The focus ring is also very smooth. The aperture ring is smooth as well. So basically all around, this lens has a very nice build, and the usability of it is basically endless. Now obviously there are some drawbacks to this lens. Number one, no autofocus. This 35mm lens actually does have electronic contacts on the back of the lens, so you can control aperture via a dial on the camera instead of having, manually switch the aperture ring. The problem is, though, no autofocus, as I said before. So for me, it is a drawback, but again, it's a drawback in certain situations. For example, if I'm shooting sports, I would not use that lens. I would use a, number one, way bigger focal distance length. I'll probably use my 70-200 zoom or borrow like a 400mm prime from a friend or something like that, because I can't get on the field and shoot it, shoot all the stuff up close. Now, if I need to shoot a picture of the stadium or something like that where it's really, really wide, maybe I will use that lens. But for action, for anything that moves really quickly, for anything that requires you to basically lock on the target and follow the target like across the field, like a soccer player, football player, any of that kind of stuff, this lens will not do the job unless you are really, really good at manual focus. And I'm pretty good at it, but I cannot beat the autofocus capability that just does it so much faster and so much better. The other drawback to this particular lens is the weight. It is a pretty heavy lens. I want to say it's about maybe 2 pounds for the lens, so it is pretty heavy. It is also pretty big if you compare, 35 to a 50. It is a pretty big 35mm lens. I didn't mind it. As a matter of fact, I bought this lens because it was so big. I like big lenses, whatever. But the thing is, for some people, the weight, especially if you travel a lot like I do, for some of you, that might be a problem because you hold this thing for the whole day in your backpack in addition to other lenses, other camera bodies, microphones, Zoom recorders, you name it. And it gets pretty tiring after a while, so weight is definitely something that you might want to take into consideration. Now let's look at some pros and cons of that lens, basically, as you finish it all off. The pros, in my opinion, manual aperture as well as having the context on the back to be able to change it with the dial. For some of you, that's a must-have. You like that kind of feature. Manual focus, and mainly with the focus ring that stops at one end and the other end, so you don't have the spinning focal ring. And the other, the vernier scale, that tells you exactly the focus distance that you're on. So those, and the build, of course, the build. The build of the lens is very solid, very great. I traveled with this lens a lot. I banged it a lot of times. It still is kicking, no problems. So let's talk about the cons of the 35mm lens made by Rokinon. So obviously, number one, no autofocus. So you're not gonna have the autofocusing capability if you're shooting moving objects, etc. on this lens, which is something that a lot of photographers kind of need and use, like myself. But I can give that up because I use this lens only in certain situations. Now, the second con of this lens is the fact that it's pretty heavy. The weight is definitely something to keep in mind, because if you travel, if you walk around and stuff like that, this lens is gonna put quite a bit of strain on your back, etc. When you're walking through the town taking photos. The third con of this lens is the fact that it has distortion. It has a little bit of a barrel distortion when you're shooting things, especially where there are a lot of verticals involved, like houses. If you're shooting anything where there are straight lines and you're trying to basically balance your verticals on a tripod, this lens becomes really difficult to do so. So what I ended up doing is basically shooting it as it is and then correcting it in post. But that is something that can turn a lot of people off. However, what I do want to say is the fact that lenses that do not distort or distort very little are also very expensive. The only lenses that I know that do not distort even at 25mm focal length are Zeiss lenses, and those things run at about $1,000 a piece. So obviously not everybody when they're starting out can afford to spend that much money, so I think it's okay to give up some of the quality in the very beginning in order to get the clients, get the money, and later invest all of that stuff into better lenses and better equipment. So then again, choose for yourself if that lens fits your parameters, and if you like it, leave those comments in the comment section. Again, I would like to know what do you think about Rokinon lenses, what do you think about Nikon lenses, manual aperture versus electronic, and manual focus, and all that kind of stuff. Leave those comments in the comment section below. I would really like to start a conversation about that. Now, the third lens that I'm going to talk about is a tight lens. The focal length of this lens is a Rokinon 85mm f1.4. Now, this lens is not as versatile as something like a 50 because, again, it is a very tight lens. I use it a ton, and you should too. Use it for things like portraits, or for example in film. Sometimes when you're shooting a video, you really want to have that intimate scene. That would be the lens that I would probably use in those scenarios, just because it focuses your eye on the subject, on the thing that you want people to see and you want people to pay attention to. Now, the good thing about this particular Rokinon lens, just like with the 35, it has a maximum aperture of f1.4. And in a tight lens, that actually plays quite a bigger role than in a wide, because when you're shooting things like portraits or when you're shooting video where you want audience to be focused on one particular thing, this lens really allows you to have that really shallow depth of field or bokeh effect, so that it brings the viewer's eye exactly to the thing that you want them to be focused on. The other thing about having a maximum aperture at f1.4 is the fact that this lens is great in low light. I have shot basically countless events with this lens where I would shoot speakers on stage, I would shoot people in hallways, like in places like hotels and clubs and concert venues and things like that, where lighting is really bad. It's really dim, and you cannot do anything about it. You cannot go and lit the whole place up. So this lens really allows you to take great photos in that low light condition. Now, just like a 35mm Rokinon that I mentioned, this lens has a manual aperture, so you can basically, again, adapt this lens to any other camera if you're shooting video or if you're shooting stills. It also has a manual focus, which the manual focus ring is a little bit tighter on this lens than on a 35, but I don't mind it. It's fine. I can deal with it. Not a problem for me. It also has, again, a vernier scale, so you know exactly what your focusing distance is, which is really nice, as I said before, in video production. Now, what are the cons of this lens? Now, obviously, the cons are pretty much almost the same as a 35mm that I talked about earlier. So, no autofocus. I would not advocate the use of this lens when you're shooting sports or if you're shooting any event where there's a lot of moving going on, unless you're really good at manual focus. Now, the weight of this lens is actually not as bad. It still is pretty heavy. I mean, this lens is probably about, it's about 1.5 pounds or about pound maybe. Still, you have to consider that again, because if you're traveling a lot, or if you, especially walking a lot with a backpack or something like that, this lens is gonna put some weight on it. For example, if you compare this to some of the newer lenses that are coming out there that are really light, this lens is quite heavy. Now, the other advantage of this lens is that, again, it has a focus ring that stops at one end and at the other end, which, again, you don't have to deal with that spinning ring, which I, again, cannot stand. It gives you a vernier scale, and you can basically pull focus, especially if you're like a first AC or somebody like that on the film set. It really gives you exact marks of how you need, or how fast or how slow you need to pull the focus. So that brings me to the price of this lens. Again, even today, on all of the places that I looked, used this lens runs for about $200 to $250. You cannot find a lens that will basically be an 85, a 1.4, I think below probably about 500 bucks. This lens for 200 bucks, 85mm f1.4, I think is a great addition to the arsenal of lenses that you have, and is especially great beginner's tight lens. So I know this video was kind of long because there's a lot of material to cover. Let me know if you're interested in me making more of these videos that go really much more in depth and explanation in those comments down below, and I will see what I can do for you. Now, I believe that these three lenses that I talked about, a 50, an 85, and a 35, these would be great starter lenses that all three of these you can basically get for about $500, maybe 600 bucks at most. And that is a great way to start your photography career, because there is really no other lenses unless you look at some older Nikon lenses, which are also great, by the way, and I might make a video about those in the near future as well. But these three that I personally picked and I've stuck with for years, and I have done some great image work with these lenses. So, three lenses, great starter kit. Now, go grab your camera, get the lenses, get the 50 first, 50 is the most important, and then decide if you want to go tight or wide. But ultimately, I believe you should have all three, because if you have a client or if you have a show to shoot or something, you will have the choice of different focal lengths, which will allow you to shoot wider to tighter shots. Now, thank you all very much for watching this video. If you like it, give it a thumbs up, and submit those comments in the comment section below if you have any questions about any of these lenses, photography gear, lighting, video, any of that kind of stuff. Leave those comments in the comment section down below. Please subscribe to this channel and let me know what you would want me to make a video about next time. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see y'all soon.